Hello everyone, welcome to this training session on advanced GIS methods. This time we're going to be looking at AHAH and multidimensional indices. This is part one, so there's two videos to watch. This is the first one where we're looking at the AHAH dataset specifically, so access to healthy assets and hazards. I'm Dr. Nick Bierman and I'm run training sessions for the CDRC and I'm hosting today, and I'm joined by Dr. Mark Green from the University of Liverpool, who's going to say a bit about AHAH and tell us all about it. And Mark and I are going to have a bit of discussion as we go through. Wonderful. Welcome, Mark.
Excellent. Thanks for having me today, and hello and welcome to everyone watching the video. I do hope you're all staying safe wherever you might be today. Okay, so we'll start with a little presentation. So Nick has kindly asked me to talk today and introduce our access to healthy assets and hazards resource, otherwise we refer to as AHAH. So what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of go through what it is, what it can be used for, how it was created, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the strengths and weaknesses of the resource, and there'll be a bit of discussion between me and Nick over some of these things. So let's start with, what do we mean? What is AHAH? So a bit of background. So as part of the Consumer Data Research Centre, which is an ESRC investment, and really the CDRC was kind of set up to try and open up data and opportunities to kind of connect researchers, academic researchers, to more kind of private industry, consumer firms who have often quite impressive or interesting data that might have some value to public society. So this might be things like loyalty card data, it might be more kind of official records that we might be able to use in different ways to answer some kind of society's most pressing problems. So the CDRC was sort of set up as a front to try and kind of act as a kind of middle person to broker some of these relationships and provide data access to some of these sensitive and useful data sets. And as part of that kind of CDRC project, what we've also been doing is kind of processing some of these data that we can't necessarily openly share and trying to derive indicators from them, or small area measures. And these are across a whole range of topics. So for example, we've been doing a lot of work around trying to look at retail dynamics, looking at high street sales, looking at high street location performances. There's a whole strand of research looking at things around, like, how do we tell individuals' ethnicity from their names, which might be important, for example, in hospitals where they don't necessarily know them, but they might want to know differences and inequalities in risk and outcomes. And also there's been a whole suite of indicators around kind of health, healthy environments, which is what we're really going to talk about today. So within that kind of health indicators team, we've been developing what we call the AHAH project, which is a collaboration between myself and Professor Alex Singleton and Alec Davies, who are all based in the geography department at the University of Liverpool. We also have, we also worked with Costas Darras and Ben Barr, who are in public health, again at the University of Liverpool. And we've also had a lot of input from Public Health England around designing some of the kind of health indicators work that we've been doing. So why was we interested in kind of looking at health, and particular healthy environments? Well, for example, let's take this individual. Now, we might be interested in what drives this individual's health. We might talk about their diet, their physical activity, but they aren't, you know, they live in the world around them, and they don't live in some sort of social vacuum. They interact with the world that's around them. And that might be whether they live in an area that has polluting industries. That might mean that air quality is much poorer in their environment, which might then impact on their respiratory health. It might be their access to health services, whether that's something more formal like GPs, hospitals, and of course, it might be that, and if an individual is really far away from their GP, they might put off going to see them as quickly as possible because it's just a bit more of a faff to get there. Or it could be whether they live in an area that has lots of gyms, leisure services that might encourage them to be physically active. And of course, it might be linked to the retail environment around them. It could be around whether they have healthy food that's both accessible and affordable around them. It might be that if they live in an area of lots of pubs, that they're more or less likely to drink as well. And it could be a whole range of things around supermarkets, casinos. These environmental influences might have an impact on people's behaviours. But even if this kind of concept around how the neighbourhood might shape and our accessibility to features in the neighbourhood might shape our behaviours, it's also something that's really important to policymakers as well. In particular, modifying environments and neighbourhoods is something that's really important and something that we can feasibly do as local and national governments, whether that might be local governments restricting the location of new fast food outlets, whether it's around building more green spaces, or whether it's about trying to understand the equitable accessibility to health services for planning new location of GPs or pharmacies. So it seems like geographic context, the neighbourhood really matters, at least might influence our health, but it also matters from a policy perspective. But at the same time, it's quite tricky to get hold of these data. Often these data aren't exactly open. They might be stored by data providers who don't share it. Sometimes they're stored by local governments who just don't talk to each other, so you don't have a national level data set. And often these data come in really awful formats that just need processing. They need kind of creating into a much more user-friendly concept for them to be able to use. So with those kind of issues in mind, we set out to try and create kind of the most comprehensive open database of small area indicators around healthy environments, health-related features of environments, and making that all openly and freely accessible to researchers, to the public, so they can start to have a look at how their environments are. They can start to see whether there are links to people's health issues in their local areas, and whether there's sort of actionable objectives that they can use to push for change in these environments. And then we also set out to try and develop a summary index, so a multi-dimensional index that would summarize all of these features of environments at the same time, around trying to kind of provide something that's a bit more easy, manageable, a way of targeting maybe unhealthy environments. And what we ended up with is our kind of access to healthy assets and hazards resource, which is hosted on the CDRC platform. So you can find that on the Maps platform, which we'll come back to a bit later in this talk, as well as the data all being openly accessible on the CDRC data server. So what can it be used for? So we have quite a range of data, and there's a lot of data opportunities because we've created quite a suite of measures that might be useful for different contexts. In particular, if we're interested in looking at accessibility to certain stores or certain features of environments, that might be a really good way of trying to understand what are the problems facing our populations. So for example, on this slide, we're just looking at the median distance, so the average distance of an area or a postcode within an area to its nearest pharmacy, pub, GP, dentist. And what we can see is actually most of our population is quite accessible to many of these services that might be good or bad for their health. So most people are less than 1 kilometre to their nearest pharmacy, but about 44% of our population in Great Britain is within 1 kilometre of a pub or a GP, which probably says something wonderful about British society. But of course, this might then give us an idea of trying to understand, well, which types of people, which populations are more or less have greater exposure to some of these facilities. So if we take, for example, fast food outlets as one of our examples, and we can look at the distance to a nearest fast food outlet, and we can split it by level of deprivation using the index of multiple deprivation. In this case, we're just looking at deciles, so 10% equal bands for areas where 1 is the most deprived areas and 10 are the least deprived areas. Actually, those areas in the least deprived decile are twice as far away from their nearest fast food outlet than compared to the most deprived areas, which might try to help us to understand health inequalities, in particular, a lack of healthy access to foods in the most deprived areas that might go one way to explaining social inequalities in obesity. Our data might be useful for linking to social surveys, linking them to kind of other data sets, other administrative data sets, and we've looked at this ourselves, trying to link our kind of overall index as well as some of the other indicators from the original version of AHAH. And what we've found is that sometimes there's associations to health, and sometimes they vary in what they're associated to. So for example, the overall index, we don't find necessarily any association to an individual's physical health, but we do find that areas, people who live in areas with much poorer kind of overall scores also have poorer well-being at the same time. And we can start to split that out by all of the specific indicators. So when we look at the environment domain, people who live in areas that have less green space or poorer air quality, they also have poorer physical health at the same time. This might be important for then trying to elucidate the drivers and determinants of health amongst individuals, but also amongst areas at the same time. From a more applied local government aspect, it's been used by quite a few local governments around targeting areas and trying to understand the state of inequalities in their local environments. So for example, the Tower Hamlets local authority were using AHAH, our overall index, to make a case for how unhealthy most of the areas in their local area are. In particular, saying that the majority of their population really live in areas that are classified as quite poor on our AHAH index compared to other London boroughs at the same time. And therefore, trying to make that case that they need to intervene in environments to try and change those, to make them a bit more positive. Of course, that could be that's the overall index, but also more specific individual indicators that we've created have also been used by many local governments. For example, Gloucestershire, who are using it to monitor air quality and map that out to try and see, well, which populations, which area have poorer air qualities, higher air pollutants, to try and make that case again for why they need to try and tackle these issues. So some of this data can be used for both a monitoring aspect as well as trying to understand some of the issues facing their local populations.
So thanks, Mark. It's great to see some examples of what the index can be used for, particularly in local authorities. And it sounds though you're trying to collect a huge amount of different data together and to create a relatively easy to use index. Is the easy to use aspect something that the local authorities have liked? So it's allowed them to actually get a grapple on this data.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest issues we faced when we started talking to local authorities about what they might want was that they don't necessarily always have the technical and skills capacity to generate these indicators themselves. So, for example, when we met with Liverpool City Council, they had all of the data on the location of fast food outlets, they had the location of GPs, they had a lot of that kind of air quality monitoring information, but they didn't necessarily have the kind of skills to process it for generating things like, well, how does access to these features vary across their local areas? Mm-hmm. So what they really benefited from was actually us saying, well, we've got this technical setup that we can just generate these data for what you need. And making that openly available allowed them to kind of just use that. There was no barriers to it. It was very quick and easy. And of course, we've set out with, appropriate metadata to try and make it clear what is available as well.
So was their kind of input quite important in terms of how you constructed the index as well, in terms of what was important and what wasn't?
Yeah, so I mean, we had Public Health England on as an advisory board, but we also talked to a few local authorities about what they'd like to see in that, the set of indicators that we've created. So we had a bit of input, and I think the biggest thing they said was, well, we just like to see a lot of these indicators because we simply don't have the data often. Mm-hmm. But something we've always been quite open about with our kind of AHAH resource is actually that if there's something missing or people want something created, that we probably have the bandwidth to create it. We've got a lot of that technical setup now. So if people get in contact and say, hey, we're really interested in this issue, well, if we can create it, we will, because, we like to think that we're a good resource that at least matches what people think are useful rather than, ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was also, that process around what was needed was also supported by a kind of general scoping review across the literature to see what were important aspects of environments to measure. So going from that evidence as well as talking to stakeholder groups.
Yeah, and if you're listening to this and do want more information or do have suggestions about improvements, there will be some contact details below the video. So please do get in touch and let us know what would be useful for you as well. I think now might be a great time to go into kind of how you constructed the index a bit more, because so far we've got there's a huge amount of data which you alluded to at the beginning, but how do you kind of combine that into the index that we've talked about?
Awesome. Okay, so we'll go on to now how we created what we did and what we do have available. So what we kind of came up with was this general framework, in that what was interesting is how do we create an indicator and how do we do that in a fairly robust way. So for example, let's take the example that we want to look at the travel time to your nearest GP for a local area. So we identify that particular indicator, and that comes out of that process of talking to stakeholders as well as that kind of literature review process. What we do is then we try to access that data, and in case of the GP records, we get them from NHS Digital for England and Wales, and then the National Records for Scotland have their GP locations for Scotland. So we collect information that has the location of all GP surgeries, their location, and then we also get hold of all the postcodes for every area in Great Britain. So talking about 1.75 million postcodes. Using those kind of two sets of information, so we have postcodes of individuals and areas, we have postcodes of the kind of service and GP. What we do is we do a very simple step first. We take for every postcode, we draw a little buffer around it, and then we say, right, we're just going to focus on the nearest 10 GPs within that buffer. So we define an arbitrary distance, and we define an arbitrary number of GPs to look at. But we do this first step really because it saves on a lot of computation at the next step. The next step then is, once we've got our kind of 10 roughly nearest GPs, is we use something called Routino. So Routino is an open source piece of software that allows us to calculate travel time from 2 points. We supplied Routino with the kind of road network distances or public pavements as well from OpenStreetMap, which allows Routino then to calculate using a lot of information around speeds and mode of transport. In our case, we just use car travel time to work out the time and distance to a nearest set of other points, in our case, from postcodes of individuals to postcodes of GPs. The reason we took those kind of first step of subsetting the nearest 10 GPs is because we could have done the nearest travel time to all GPs, but that would just take forever. And whilst it's only 1.75 million postcodes, it's taking really about 8 hours processing time to do the whole country, which is quite a significant effort really, even on our kind of more beefier servers. So what we do is we calculate then, we identify the nearest GP, and then we store that information. So for that each postcode of, in Great Britain, we have the travel time and distance to its nearest general practice. And then we take that information and we aggregate those up to various different geographical zones. In our case, we used lower super output areas for England and Wales and data zones for Scotland. So they're roughly equivalent, although those data zones are slightly smaller. And essentially we just take a median value, we take the average, which then gives us a kind of summary at that spatial scale. And that was kind of important because we could make the postcode information available. It is a controlled data source via the CDRC, but it's not necessarily particularly useful, whereas showing it at kind of a neighborhood level it's a bit easier for people to grasp, and it's also tends to be the spatial scales that local authorities are using. So it's kind of designed with our stakeholders in mind.
Now's probably a good time to mention that if you're new to using GIS data, you will come across terms like LSOA and data zone, and there's a whole suite of different things. So if these are new to you, do look them up, and there's various resources available that explain what they all are. So was the selection of LSOAs, that was informed by the local authorities that you worked with to a degree? Was that right, Mark?
Yeah. Basically, that's what they said was the most common statistical sort of neighbourhood zones that they were using. So it was to try and match what they thought was useful.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, so we'll get back. So what we did is we did that sort of process for a series of indicators, and we kind of grouped them into sort of general domains. We'll come to the domains in a minute. So what we did is we calculated distance to nearest fast food outlet, pub, bar or nightclub, gambling outlet, tobacconist, off license, which we all kind of grouped them together as part of the retail services essentially. We then looked at a series of health services, including GP surgeries, hospitals with A&E services, dentists, pharmacies. We stuck leisure centre and gym with those in this kind of grouping of domains simply because it was more of a positive part of the environment. They didn't seem to fit, in the retail services, they're all more negative aspects of health. We also had an air quality series of measures. Now with this, we didn't calculate distance and accessibility because it didn't really make any sense. Rather, we took some of the DEFRA estimates on air pollutants and we just calculated mean values based upon those estimates for the same areas. We ended up picking 3 pollutants, SO2, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, PM10, and nitrogen dioxide, because they ended up being what we thought from the literature were most important. And a lot of these pollutants are kind of highly correlated. So we couldn't stick every one of them in because it would cause a lot of issues around multicollinearity further down the line. We then have a final domain, which we call the natural environment, which has a kind of mixture of mean and distance values. We have mean value of green space within an 800-meter buffer of a postcode, which just any amount of green space, which we kind of call the passive role. It's the green space where you're moving through an area that you might benefit from. And then we have a series of distance to nearest measures, including distance to nearest green space, but being a bit more narrow, active places that you might be going to parks, grasslands, might be going for a run or to meet friends. Actually, it's really about engaging with it rather than, say, walking through a leafy suburb. And also blue space, lakes, rivers, or the sea. So we generate quite a lot of these measures, again, based upon what stakeholders suggested, and also from the literature. So we have a series of indicators and we group them into these kind of 4 domains. And this is where we start to get involved in the kind of multi-dimensional index creation, which will be covered in the second part of the video in a bit more detail. So what we do is we take all of the indicators, for example, in the retail domain, we standardize them across the whole, so they're all kind of on the same level playing field. And then we take a kind of average value, essentially, which we call our retail average domain score. We do that for each of the 4 domains. And then again, we aggregate them up. So we kind of standardize them and then take an average score, which becomes our overall index, which we call the AHAH index. And that's how we get from kind of producing these wonderful diverse indicators towards getting an overall measure of how kind of what the environment is like across these kind of 4 concepts. And all of that data, we've made it all openly available. So the code is available somewhere on GitHub for reproducing it. But we also have an interactive mapping resource, which allows you to engage with that data directly on the CDRC website. And also you can download the raw data for all versions of AHAH through the CDRC website as well. And just to give you a kind of a flavor of what that looks like, Nick has asked me to give a kind of a trial of the new Maps website, which isn't currently live as we record this video. So you're getting something new and exciting in that regards. But just to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like. So this is the CDRC Maps website, which will be the new incarnation. The old one, it looks pretty similar, but has less functionality. But it allows you to kind of get a more of a kind of general sense to interact with that resource in one go. We've got the AHAH data all loaded in at the minute. And we can, just much like Google Maps, zoom in, zoom out to areas. And it sometimes takes a minute to kind of load in aspects because it's got a lot of information, a lot of data kind of being processed. We can have a look at the boundaries for regions, government regions. We can add in local authorities. We can add in even the buildings if we want as well. And it gives us a bit more of a way of interacting with this data set. And again, you can just download all these data and create these maps yourself. It's all there to be used. But what we found is this really works at kind of getting the public involved, and actually they really like this more interactive mapping aspect because it makes it a bit more real. And certainly those more public users who've emailed me about the Excel and CSV files we provide with the raw data, they really struggle with that because it's not necessarily set up quite as helpfully. So in this case, what we're doing is we're looking at Liverpool, which is where I'm based, and we're looking at our overall AHAH index. It has on the right-hand side, it has the kind of legend, which tells you in this case we're looking at deciles where the blue values are doing very well, or at least healthy environments, and the red are worst performing. So these are the poorer environments. And I think what really struck us when we created this initially, because we wasn't sure, you always kind of, when you create something, you're not sure whether it will tell you anything of value. But at least seems to pick up things that we might expect make sense. So in Liverpool, you see a lot of red clustered around the city centre area. There's a lot of kind of retail opportunities there. There's generally very few GP services. There's no green space. Well, there's very little green space. So that's why that's going to come up as bad. But also it picks up really subtle inequalities by space as well. So you can see that red kind of continues north of the city centre and also out east. And these are more deprived areas that tend to have a greater concentration of some of the unhealthy retail aspects, as well as kind of poorer access to health services sometimes, and also poorer access to green space. But you can see it also picks up nice parts in kind of South Liverpool, around Sefton Park, around Childwall. So it's still picking up a kind of, it's not just treating cities as the same, it's picking up quite a lot of variance in the types of environments and neighbourhoods people are exposed to. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Nick?
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see, and it's great, and I'd really recommend that everybody do this. If you are based in the UK and there's an area have a look at the maps for where you're based, and does that match your expectations? Because you have often kind of knowledge about your local area, where's the more deprived areas and less deprived, and so on. One thing I think it might be worth adding is we can dive into the individual domains as well, so the 4 different sections, and we can do that on the map site. I think we saw the scores listed, but you can pull up the maps for each domain as well. In terms of how it's actually used, do the people who've used the data so far, are they generally using the overall index or one of the 4 domains for the kind of work that they're doing?
We kind of got mixed. So we've got quite a few people like that overall indicator because it's something that's quotable, or it's something that's a bit more simple to present. What we find though is also people like to just focus on a specific indicator. So they'll just look at the accessibility to fast food outlets, for example, because that's their specific focus. They're not interested in the other aspects of this. And I think that flexibility in what people can use it for is actually quite useful. And it's not just about, here's one indicator of how we think the world works, go and use it. Actually, because we make it all openly available, the inputs, the outputs, we want people to use it in however way fits with what they need. And it's also, since the code's there, it's more open for people to take it apart, rebuild it, and say, actually, we think it's slightly better at looking like this. Mm-hmm. And that conversation is always good to have, to be honest.
Yeah. It's great to have that flexibility. So we have the kind of top level index overall, and then we have the 4 domains, and then we have the individual indicators as well. And are they all on the map site
Yeah,
as well as
they're
the
all
data?
available to download, and they're all on the Maps site as well. So you can have a look at fast food outlet accessibility. You can look at the pollution. All of that is on the Maps website as well, and that's where we've got a lot of leverage from the public in particular, who really like to just click through and look at all of these different aspects. And they find it really interesting, actually, not just looking at that overall index, but actually just looking at specific features of their environments and trying to see, well, what are the local issues in my area?
Mm. And that it strikes me, it's a really powerful tool, the index itself, but also the visualization. So it's not just having the data itself, but it's being able to show the stakeholders or whoever might be interested, this is a specific indicator, and these are some of the issues we need to deal with at a local level, or we need to address.
Yeah, it makes the data more real. And I think the stereotype of a geographer is we like to map everything, but there's a reason for that, and that's because it's such an easy and intuitive way of visualizing and sensing the world. And that kind of the classic, that a picture can tell 1,000 words, speaks volumes in maps, I think.
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I'm biased because I'm also a geographer, but I'd really emphasize that. And the power of showing data on a map is really, really useful. And there's lots of resources out there if you've got your own data set or stuff you want to show on the map yourself. So please do check that out as well. That's great. That's a wonderful demo, and great to see the new map site in action. I think the kind of last chunk it would be good to have a look at now is what are kind of some of the strengths and the weaknesses of the AHAH index, because we've heard quite a lot of the uses, but there's always limitations with this. So could you tell us a little bit about those two, please?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the final thing we'll talk about is some of the strengths and weaknesses of this resource. So I think as a general strength, I think the commitment to open source is very important because it removes a lot of those barriers. It makes that data openly available. It's there for people to use and however they might want to use it. And again, it's the inputs, it's the indicators, it's the domain scores, everything is openly available and people can use what they need. They're not just limited to one thing. We have the wonderful mapping resource, which I think is brilliant. It just makes that so much easier to engage with. And you can have a quick look at kind of issues in your local area and then download the data for a more deeper analysis if you wanted to, but it doesn't associate any kind of technical expertise. And we don't think there, we have such a range of indicators on there now that there's very few other tools that have such a range of free open source kind of measures of healthy environment. So we think it's probably the most comprehensive in Great Britain, which is good. And of course, as I alluded to before, if there's stuff that you think is missing from there, well, we've got all of these methods, the infrastructure, the technical abilities, it's all set up now. So we'd love to hear from you of anything you'd like to see included. And, I think it's important that, it's not just what we think should go in there, it's more of an interactive process. Now, I think the weaknesses really fall into kind of 2 main areas. And one of them is around kind of technical issues, which I'll come to in a moment. The other one is around framing of this. And one of those kind of framing issues is, well, what do you really mean when you create an overall indicator? And what does that actually mean? So if you've got an AHA score of 20 versus 23, what does that really mean? And it's a problem because the actual index doesn't really have any necessary meaning. It has the kind of variation matters. So having a high score versus a low score, then there's some value in that because you're saying, well, this area is better or worse than that area. But those kind of specific around, well, how do you interpret any of the numbers or the ranks can be problematic. There's a big difference between kind of urban and rural areas. And often this is something we get a lot of discussion around, in that our index sort of shows the rural areas to be not always as healthy as we might assume them to be. And often people say, well, they're really green, they're really low air quality, so surely they should be quite healthy. But because obviously on our index, they're also located far away from health services, And often a lot of that green space is just not simply accessible. And there's one thing about living next to it's really nice to live next to a farmer's field, but you can't necessarily go and engage with it. You can probably look at it and benefit passively, but not necessarily actively. But I think, it's really about opening up these discussions about what do we value for health and environments, really. A lot of discussion we get, and this is from doing a lot of the outreach of work with AHAH, is that it's just not IMD. It doesn't look exactly the same as the index of multiple deprivation, which I kind of, I put grown there, is because, well, we didn't set out to create the index of multiple deprivation because it already exists. We set out to create something different. And so, we shouldn't always assume that these things are all linearly related. But, when you've got one measure that kind of dominates things, people just, they like one index, I think.
There's a lot to be said for, there being one index to measure deprivation, but we need to remember that it's often kind of multifaceted. So there's lots of things going on. And the index of multiple deprivation is a great resource, and it gets a lot of coverage, but it's only measuring certain aspects, and it's trying to get that balance between how much detail we go into and how easy to use do we make it. And there's often a kind of tension between the two, because we can't, the world is not simple. There are these complexities in it. There are these kind of variations that we have to take into account, but it's trying to get that balance. So, you've probably used the IMD already, but this resource is different, but you can use them together.
Yeah, and actually it's really interesting when you look at the interaction between the two measures, and you're looking at deprived areas that have good and bad environments and seeing, well, does that influence differences in health?
Okay.
We have quite a large range of measures, but of course there might be stuff that's missing from there, as we discussed. We've tried to be as comprehensive as possible, but there's stuff that we kind of miss out, I think. And of course it's a descriptive tool. It's just an indicator that measuring environments, it's not saying these environments are definitely causing bad health. It's more saying, well, how do we measure these environments to actually look at how important they are to health, really. Some of the technical problems with it, well, I think the biggest issue really comes down to the selection of weightings and how you weight the indicators and the domains. Now, we went about this by just weighting them equally. So we treat the retail domain, the health domain, the air quality and the green space domains as just equal. They all have the same. We say they have the overall same influence on our overall indicator. But we've had quite a lot of criticism about that, saying, well, the retail domain doesn't necessarily influence health as much as the health domain. Some things might be more or less important. The issue with that is that there is no evidence, or nobody knows which is most important and how we should weight them. And so any weighting is kind of going to be biased and unfair. So we kept it as even, just simply because that was, the fairest way. We didn't have any reasoning to change the weightings. Now, like I say, we make all of the data openly available, so we're all for people reweighting it however they want to and using it in the ways that they want to do.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and we'll pick some of that up in the practical sessions. So when you get to that point in the practical, you have that option of reweighting, and we'll say a little bit more about that in the next video as well.
There's some general issues that maybe we don't provide uncertainty of estimates, and we're just providing a point estimate. Maybe people want error bars on these things. We only have 2 time periods at the minute, 2016, 2017. We're about to update to the more recent period of data we have. One of the issues is we can't go backwards, we can only go forwards, which is a bit difficult, because if you want to link it to historical data, which is where it's really interesting, if you've got 10 years worth of data, that would be fascinating. We just can't do it at the minute, and we don't have the data going further back, which is a problem.
One question I've always wondered about the time period is, can you do comparisons? So can you look at the data in 2016 and then the same area in 2017 and say it's changed to get better or worse?
You can. We did make some revisions to the overall index, so we've increase the number of indicators from 2016 data to 2017. So you'd have to be careful in what might be a change because of the environment changing and what might be because of the changes in that methodology. So we do offer some caution to those kind of comparisons. However, we are, we're not looking to make any revisions going forward. So in theory, it should be a bit more stable. And some of those changes came out of discussions with Public Health England after the first release of our indicator. I think the last comment I'll make is really, all we're looking at is accessibility to certain services, but it might not necessarily always be the best way of looking at environments. It might be that we want to look at the density of places. It's not just that you're less than 1 kilometre away from a fast food outlet, it's that you live in an area with 20 of them in very close proximity, and actually that might matter more. So how we try and measure environments might influence how we view the world and how we kind of get a handle around these health inequalities. And we're only really offering one aspect of that. We've just kept it simple and consistent. Okay, so that's really the end of what I was going to present on today. Like I say, all of that data is available openly and freely via the Maps website, and it can be downloaded from there as well. And we hope that it's a really useful tool that can give a kind of very detailed sense of small area issues around healthy environments. If you want any more further reading around the kind of tool, AHAH, and the resource, there's 3 really nice papers come out. So we have one in Health and Place, which is open access, which is really technical details around creating this multi-dimensional index. So it goes through a lot of those more technical details, but also has then that linked to the social survey data as well to see how useful it might be. We have a paper in Scientific Data, which really kind of charts the whole of the resource and goes through what we've created, some of it about how we created some of these individual indicators as well. And we also have a kind of free short technical report that kind of goes over data sources, how they're created, which is a good kind of thing to refer to whenever you're using the resource. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand it back to Nick.
Great, wonderful. Thank you very much, Mark. That was it's great to get a good overview of the AHAH index and a few of the details of how people are using it, but also the different components and what we might be able to do with it in the future. So there's so much potential there. And I really would recommend everyone to certainly have a look at the Maps website, have an explore, and try downloading the data yourself. And in the practical session that follows this, we'll be doing that. So we'll be doing that in our studio and creating some maps and giving you the tools to actually play about and explore. So please do that, and do let us know how you get on. There's options to leave comments, so please do. And if you've got any thoughts or questions, please do drop us a line, and we'll do our best to answer them. Wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the session. I would recommend that you also have a look at the second video in due course. We'll delve a bit more into the methods there, so how we actually create the multidimensional indices, and how we can make some of those changes. So we'll talk a bit more about the weightings, we'll talk a bit more about how we combine the different domains and why we pick certain data sets and so on. So there's lots more interesting stuff in that. So we will see you in the next video. Take care and goodbye.